On this day last year, we went to the ballot to elect a new crop of leaders. The president, we were very sure that we were going to get a new president because the one who was in office was leaving. And why was he leaving? Because the constitution said that he had to leave after serving 2 terms in office. And now we knew the new leader will only have a maximum of 2 terms in office. We want to talk about those constitutional term limits and why they're there in the constitution. We are joined by 2 guests from the Katiba Institute. One of them is Patriciah Joseph. She's a program manager at Katiba Institute, and Kevin Mabonga is the head of communications. Good morning, Patriciah. Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning.
Good morning. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation. That's the hot seat of the Situation Room. Don't worry. Feel relaxed, okay?
Yeah. We don't bite on Wednesday.
Relax this way. I'll tell you the day's proverb. Today's proverb is from West Africa, from any of the countries, Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso. What's standing out about those 3 countries? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the proverb. The proverb is, bad things come to one's mother. Good things will also come to her. Bad things come to one's mother. Good things will also come to her. Kevin, what's your interpretation of this proverb?
Well, my interpretation is that there are always 2 sides of every situation. There's always the good side of the situation, and there's always the bad side of the situation. And maybe later on I'll relate to our discussions today. Yeah.
Okay. Patriciah, what's yours?
I see it as a reality of life that my mother could be my country, who I love very much, good things will happen to her, and bad things will also happen to her. And I think as we discuss later on, we will see that we may have protections of term limits, but it doesn't mean that it will not. It may have a good intention, but it doesn't mean it will not be challenged or people will abuse what it seeks to do.
Good one. So let's get straight into it in terms of term limits. So our constitution places some term limits not only on the position of president, but also in other constitutional institutions. Why are term limits important, Patriciah?
I could start by saying, one, it's a rule of law question. Governance is, we are governed by a system of democracy where we go through elections and elect different people. So in that sense, then term limits become an important element of the rule of law because it's also an opportunity to ensure there's a peaceful transition of power. It also, and through that way, it also ensures that we develop a system of stability, which is also important for the development of a country. And then if you relate it to our situation in Kenya, we have a society made of many different diverse groups. And in that case, even when we talk about regional representation, different political parties, different ethnic groups and all that, then term limits, it becomes an important element of ensuring that that is actually realized as our constitution envisages, where we don't have one person representing a group that then holds power indefinitely. Yeah.
So let's look at those offices that have term limits. President, deputy president, term limits. Governor, deputy governor, term limit, right? Chief Justice has a limit of how long they can serve, right? The limit to their tenure. And there are several other institutions. The controller of budgets, the auditor general, the director of public prosecutions, and others. You're saying that this is so that there is some semblance of order, but what's wrong with having somebody serve as Chief Justice? I mean, why the number of years that have been set? For example, for a Chief Justice to serve, why those years? Why not +2? Why not -2? How long should a Chief Justice serve? 7 years? Or if they attain the age, right? Why not 10 years? Why not 15? Why not 5, like a president?
Okay, I'll respond to that. That's a good question. And when we discuss about the idea of term limits, it's basically about control of. It's one of the items that attempts to control power. And Maybe later on I'll give an example of a president in one of the East African countries. So when he took power, said that the problem with leaders is that they tend to want to stay in power for so long. More than 35 years later, he's still a president. But then the concept is to try and control power, and there has been so many people have done research about the concept of power, and they agree that when someone stays in office for too long, then there are chances that there will be increased levels of corruption. Afrobarometer researchers indicate that there are chances that human rights violations will increase. There are chances that that person might not take advice or might forget, if it's an elected position, the people that elected them. And that's why it's important that when we place limits on elected leaders and even the offices that you mentioned, like the key offices, so as to ensure that someone does not become indispensable, to ensure that there is some form of control of power that someone enjoys. Yeah.
I just want to, I like us to little bit twist it and bring it home. I know Eric was talking about, brought in the issues of the CJ, the Chief Justice and the others, but I looked at the report and it's focusing on the elective seats. So hearing you and hearing her, I think you say that term limits, specifically the function is to minimize corruption and abuse of power, open government to new people and new ideas, because unfortunately sometimes just because you stay longer, experience does not mean that you will actually have new ideas. And then of course to infuse innovation, creativity in solving national issues, and of course to reinvigorate democracy. That for me, I look at term limits specifically as a function that targets the executive largely across the world. Why I'm actually talking about bringing it home is that we have sneaked a little bit of executive functions to the legislature. And I'm talking about CDF because there is a direct correlation between the high number of re-election of members of parliament this time round. This is the first time we've retained so much of a number. The attrition level is normally about 67% with CDF. So I have always challenged people that you can actually do a technical paper between the death of the legislature as we know it, or the death of parliament as we know it in Kenya, and CDF. So, and in our case, of course, like everybody else, there is no term limits to being a member of parliament. But apparently now with CDF, you can actually be a member of parliament for life. So initially, of course, term limits were targeting the executive, and now we are sneaking in a little bit of those functions to the legislature. And you can actually see that even the president is talking about anchoring CDF in the law. How do we go forward about, how do we think about that? Because somehow these things keep on evolving.
Well, okay. Let me first of all comment on the background you've raised, and in relation to term limits. When we say it's an issue of control of power, there's also that aspect of checking of power. And one way of limiting government is to have that system of separation of power, because it foresees that if we have a president, then we have a legislature that checks on the exercise of executive powers. But then we have this situation in Kenya where the president, and I think we come from a history of an imperial president, which is still a factor in Africa, where the imperial presidency, despite our new constitution of 2010, is still a factor that we keep seeing emerging. This is because, one, there's expectation on paper that Parliament will do its functions as expected, that it will actually do the big function that we don't see of oversight, although for checking the executive. Then we don't see that happening in practice as we would want, because with our system, you'd expect that some of the issues that have been going on in Parliament would not happen. Secondly, again, issue of controlling that power and limiting government. We see, as you say, the encroachment of executive functions in Parliament. You see that issue of even the president going beyond his executive authority. But then also when you look behind what is behind that, we have this issue of political parties that are really the ruling party dominance. So you have a coalition, for instance, a coalition of parties in Kenya that form the dominance in Parliament. Then it translates to how power is also checked in Parliament. And you see that lower level of check of power does not happen. Then, of course, it brings us to the issue of our elections. Then do we say that people need to have limitations on how many times a person can vie? That's a question. We don't have that system right now. Maybe depending on how the lessons we see going forward, we will see. Is it something people should explore? Maybe, as you say, in-depth analysis needs to be done to see if we are checking the powers of the executive of the end of the governor, which are really executive functions. How about the elected officials? It's mainly, of course, comes from the fact that there's that aspect of the universal suffrage, but then also the president is also elected. So I can't say there's a clear answer as to why maybe that happens, but it's a lesson that has to be learned. If we are not be able to, if we have a system of checks of balances and it's not working, what happens? Will it change if we keep changing members of parliament every 10 years? I don't know. Yeah.
If we look at Kenya, I mean, where we are today, we have seen one presidency in Kenya whereby, the terms were multiple terms, in succession. Thereafter, we have not seen that there has been exceeding of terms until most recently, when we even saw that 2 terms were served and then, president exited and brought in a new administration. Now, as we're having this conversation, is there chatter, as it were, or are there indicators that would point to the possibility that someone might want to extend a term and go as far as to change what the Constitution envisages, and not just envisages, but actually goes ahead and prescribes? Do we see any of that happening, or are we just saying it is necessary to caution to make sure that the desire for excesses does not take root and then lead to something that might see a changing of the Constitution? What are we saying here?
So we don't foresee a situation whereby we haven't seen a situation in Kenya where a president has tried or attempted to extend their terms. We've had a few conversations here and there. I think last year an MP mentioned about the issue of removal of term limits, but it was dismissed immediately. But then this conversation is necessary in Kenya or in other African countries that have consistently followed the term limits, because it's a conversation. If it's lost somewhere else, it can just start. Then it just requires a very short process. Then you would see term limits removed. So it's important for citizens to know that we have this law, we have a provision of term limits, and there must be a reason why this provision was put in the Constitution. And of course, we educate people that provision is a good one. I've gone to a few counties and interacted with people, discussed about the issue of term limits. There are 2 sides of it. Some people say democracy is about the will of people. Why are you telling us that term limits then matter? I went to some 2 contrasting counties. One county A, where the governor, according to the people, performed so well. So these people are accusing us and telling us, why are you promoting this issue of term limits when if there were no term limits, our governor would have easily been elected for the 3rd term. But again, County B is where they are just praying that the term ends so that the governor goes away because of what they think the governor didn't perform well. So in general, I would say the conversation must continue because of the benefits of term limits. And as a country, maybe we'll discuss this later, the context we are facing currently looks like we are backsliding in terms of democracy and other aspects. We've had coups, instability in countries, and when you do research, countries that have consistently maintained the term limit provision of the law, they are a bit stable in terms of transition. And of course, Kenya can be that good example, and Tanzania.
You see, for Tanzania, we have seen that smooth transition. Julius Kambarage Nyerere says, Nimengatuka. And then now we've seen leaders who come, there's an election, you know, in fact, they even call it Mwongo. This is this person's reign, they leave, somebody else is coming in, right?
Yeah.
As we were heading towards the 2022 general election, a conversation had already started a couple of years earlier on. We have a young president, people. Come on, guys. I mean, we elected a young president. Where do you expect this president to go? And the BBI conversation, there are those who saw the BBI as another avenue of playing the game. Yeah, we shall have the constitutional letter of term limit being observed, but the spirit may not be. And I want to argue that it already has obvious and direct risks. You said term limit is introduced so that we can check and control power. Okay? We have introduced term limits for the position of governor. We have governors who have finished their terms as governors who are now sitting in the Senate as senators. And like Maliba said, there's no term limit for election as a senator. You can sit there for forever. The current Speaker of the Senate is a governor who finished a constitutional term limit of 2 terms as governor. Is now a Speaker of the Senate. This man is an advocate of the High Court. There's nothing that bars Amason Kingi from finishing whatever term now as Speaker of the Senate, becoming Director of Public Prosecutions, serving the constitutional limit, becoming Chief Justice, serving constitutional limit, and maybe retiring in office. So term limits are there, yes, but is it about the spirit or the letter, Patricia?
I would say the idea is both the spirit and the letter. But then again, as practice shows, is that of course, people who power, we say power tends to corrupt, and you see that whenever someone is in office, they would want to continue holding on to that power. And I could say even, and the lessons we can see in how term limits are tankered with even across the region. One of them would be you either abolish them completely, like the recent referendum in the Central African Republic. Sometimes you either introduce amendments. For instance, let's say the way you mentioned the BBI, it was quite extensive amendments, or any other amendments in the Constitution you might find. Amendments are introduced. If let's say we had a 5-year term for 2 terms, they may say, okay, let's now do 1 term of 7 years, and then they extend. Then once the amendment comes into place, we say, okay, we are starting on a clean slate. So if he had served for 10 years, he say, okay, this is a new constitution, so I deserve to vie for a position in this new constitution. So it starts a clean slate. Then again, it defeats the whole idea, the spirit here of the issue of term limits. And then we also have this situation of, and that I still want to come back to what you're saying. We have this situation, for instance, of Uganda, where an amendment will start. Sometimes it may seem very almost innocent. For instance, Uganda started by, first of all, removing the 2 terms. But then again, they had an age limit. So even if he had extended, you'd say, okay, he reaches the age limit, he will retire. Then what did they do the second time? They removed the age limit, then creating a presidency for life. So you see, the spirit that was intended is defeated by just tampering with the Constitution. So for us, then it becomes, once you hear about constitutional amendments proposed, and you look at who is bringing these amendments, most of the time you'll see the ruling, the incumbency introducing, or through now a strong parliament that is executive controlled. Then you see those. Then I think our antennae should really be up, because when you see those tampering with the Constitution, it may look like we are amending this part and this part, but then again, what will be the overall effect? It may defeat the whole idea of term limits. Or or it may lead to a consolidation of power, for instance. And this could be a long game. For some, when you have constitutional amendments that require, for instance, a super majority of parliamentarians vote, then you find that maybe 10 years in, you find a consolidation of power starts, what he was referring to earlier. Then you find a parliament that is controlled by an executive. But you may not see the long game. Then maybe eventually the long game is to ensure that by the time I'm coming for a second term with a very strong parliament of my party, then it becomes very easy to pass constitutional amendments. And you see that end game started a long time ago. And that's why we say, when you look at both the letter and the spirit of the law, we continue looking at the constitution as a whole. We look at when the consolidation of power starts, usually an executive, then we have a legislature that enables that consolidation. Then our prophetic eye should lead us to see what will this mean for us if this consolidation happens, because it will eventually defeat that idea of control of power and democratic elections, independent institutions. Then so that we look at the spirit of the law wholesomely to ensure that the idea of term limits, control of power is not defeated.
I think Ndu asked a question, and I still feel that we didn't do so much justice. So probably I'll just try to build up on that and see if we could actually ask more questions. She asked if we've seen charter, if there's a feeling. Generally, a lot of times we look at the constitution in this country and we feel like, okay, it says there's a term limit, therefore nothing can happen. But first of all, it's important to actually underscore that we have actually had 3 presidents who have adhered to term limits. Because sometimes in 1991, we brought in term limits after the Mlolongo fiasco, I think in 1988 and 89. And President Moi did not retire on his own. Even though he declared a lot of times that I said I will step down and I will not run in 202. The truth is that we already had put it in the constitution before the 1992 elections that a president would only run for 2 terms. So Moi did abide by that. Mwai Kibaki did that, and Uhuru Kenyatta almost did that. So when we say that, the Fafi MP Yakub Salah in November 2022 started that conversation. Barely, I think, 2-3 months into election, he was talking about the need to remove the term limit. What I think, and his point was that if somebody is doing good work, why then? And that is why it's actually important, I think, for you guys and everybody else who's actually championing this to laud the real function of term limits. Because apparently people think that so long as you're doing good work, then why should you? Why should there be term limits to that? So that particular bit, that if you're doing good work, I think the Constitution of Kenya has taken care of that particular bit, that if you don't do your work, we will check on you. So there is oversight, there's public participation, there's even impeachment. So that's the argument. It's important to actually to get that out. So talking about term limits as they are, not that we've not tried to do. She's actually almost said it, but then stopped. There was BBI, and then there was the BBI in BBI. We almost talked about doing a Kaputin. You know what Putin did with Medved. Then that we come in. Uganda in 2005 came up with a referendum. But it started with so many other things, and then the term limits was thrown in. Rwanda has actually done the same. So as we talk about that, it's important to remind people continuously that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that this thing is not so far. The only paradox in this conversation, by the Eric, is that the last, they call it the Niamey Declaration, was in Niger. Unfortunately, in the place where they were talking about term limits and doing the declaration, is where now apparently we might not even have a term.
When we talk about term limits, most of the times people think about the presidency. When we talk about power in this country, we still concentrate our minds on the presidency. And Malibu, like you're saying, every time we hear the issue of term limit and maybe changing term limits, we are thinking, the person who's holding the reins of the national executive may be changing the term limit and staying there longer. So, okay, let's even say that we do not touch that term limit for the president, that a president comes and serves for 5 years, gets re-elected, serves another 5 years, the end. can never be president again in this republic. But nothing stops that president from being Speaker of the National Assembly for an unlimited period of time. If term limits are introduced so that we can control power, are we looking at only the king, or are we also looking at the kingmakers and the real powers behind the power? Because if somebody is powerful enough, and like you've given the example of Vladimir Putin and Medvedev in Russia, where they just played that whole game, Medvedev becomes president, Putin prime minister, president, Medvedev prime minister, and the game is going on. How about if we just saw a case in this country where somebody has served as president, but then they go into parliament, or they are elected by their people and they serve as speaker, and this is the third most powerful seat in the country, or they serve as chief justice until they retire, or this. How do we safeguard against that control of power? Because the ultimate thing that this person is doing is they're wielding power. That's to you, Kevin.
That's a very provoking question, and in our course of implementation of this project on term limits, or discussions about term limits, we've encountered that question. And I would say that earlier on you asked about the spirit of the law, the spirit of the constitution, and I would say in this case mostly we would say the spirit, because there are some situations where we've tried, the framers of the constitution, the framers of the law tried as much as possible to safeguard against someone having absolute power. But then, as the Russia experience gives us, it shows that leaders can go through certain ways and of course escape that route. But then that's why this discussion is important to citizens. For example, if you have been a governor you've served 2 terms, why should the electorate elect you again to serve in a different position? I think at this level, it's not about the law, but probably the citizens or the electorate would play a key role to prevent you from taking another position, because now, as you put it, it will be defeating the real.
It's playing the game.
Yeah, it's playing the game.
Yeah,
basically.
I am no longer governor, but I am senator of the county.
Yeah,
I'm still in the arena.
And I'm still powerful. Actually, I will be sitting here and I'll be determining who becomes governor next, because I know how that position works. I'm a senator. I'm getting elected. I'm popular with the people. I become a kingmaker. So basically, I'll be governor for life. Term limits are just the thing on paper.
And isn't that where the danger lies? Like what Maliba reminded us about last year, when the information came that somebody was making a suggestion. It's not going to come from the executive, is it?
It's not.
It's going to come from the folks who are playing in the periphery, who also see the benefit of being in the space. Nobody necessarily wants to be. If you're not the lead actor, that's all right, but you're going to hold some position somewhere and you will still be on the stage. Is that not where the danger lies? We will rarely find, except in some, we'll rarely find that for somebody who wants to push to continue to be in that position, it's the folks around them now who start to make the suggestions, who start to float these things, and then it becomes a reality. Take your pick of the people that we've seen. We have a 90-year-old president who is in West Africa today. We have folks who were overthrown by military coups still in West Africa. We have somebody sitting here in East Africa. If you go back, you will find that the suggestions oftentimes came from their advisors, or the suggestion as to, hey man, you're doing such a wonderful job, what's wrong with you continuing? It's not necessarily for their benefit as an individual, but it also represents a benefit to the folks who are around him or her. In most cases him, but okay. Should that not be where then we place the attention?
Okay, I would say the concerns you raise are indeed valid, because and it is true. When if I'm the president and I want to extend my term, I will not, strategy-wise, I will not come and say, okay, I think I've done a good job, elect me for another term. Yes,
except your
true.
Name is Vladimir.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. and for you to be Vladimir, it means there's a lot you're controlling around you, such that your word is the one all and be all.
Yeah.
I think I would say you're right, because when you look at when the issue of term limits is coming in, if you look even at Uganda, these are the people who control the narrative, and that's why even for us, when those discussions came in, we couldn't just keep quiet about it, because it could be someone is throwing in a word and then you test the waters and see what the people will say. And what if we had said, okay, we have a young president, oh, he's done a good job, oh, and all that. So I would say yes, and for this kind of advocacy and discussion on term limits, then the focus should be multi-sectoral. We are not just having a conversation in public. We also we also and sensitizing the citizen, where we want to get the civic demand is so heightened that we can have a possibility of a pushback against such drawbacks to touch the term limits. Then also let me also say that the system that we're working with, there's a presumption sometimes that, and I think maybe we did not foresee, where we saw someone finishing a term as a governor and then going on to vie as a senator, and that becomes even quite untidy, because you're from the executive. The executive is supposed to check on the affairs of the parliament and senate in this case is supposed to check on the affairs of the executive, and then you go and become a senator in that house. There are things that will not, there are certain checks we start losing when that happens, because what if that number increases? It becomes quite dangerous. But let me say, the concern that issue of these narratives coming in should worry us, because even for us in Kenya, we can't say, even based on the proverbs of the day, that it can't happen to us. I think it would be, ignorance that thinking it will not happen, it cannot happen to us. It can happen to us. And then if you look at the other countries, when this term limits discussion comes in, there's a lot that has happened behind the scenes. Yeah. A president exercising a lot of power or consolidating it, and then using that political party dominance in, let's say, legislature, and of course controlling a narrative of the public that, oh, I've done a good job in development. Then it becomes, it's multiple factors come on board, and that's why our response then should be quite also diversified in that extent, because if we say citizens, the development is a factor. Yes, development matters. A good record of a public leader matters. But then let's also say that as citizens, we deserve both. We deserve both a democratic environment and also development, not one or the other, both.
I want to look at Kenya's possible appetite for something like this. And usually when you do something like that, you're going to have to look at Kenya in the context of a Pan-African situation, right? And if you look at the examples that we have seen around the continent, let's just take the continent as for way of example, that Kenya's appetite has not really shown to be something like that. Even in the case where we heard the suggestion, it was snuffed out quicker than you can say Bob's your uncle. That conversation died by the third day. It was finished. It was gone. So if we're going to look at Kenya comparatively to African nations, Kenya has not had an appetite for that. Kenya's leaders have not necessarily had an appetite for wanting to extend rule beyond what the rules of the land state. You haven't seen that there has been that kind of thing. People generally, when their term is over, because we're now focusing on the executive, will stand down and they'll move on to the next, right? Whether there's contention about who did or who didn't do what. Generally, people will leave. Is there danger? And that, from what we see, is there danger? Because usually, look, I'm telling you, step into these countries, step into Cameroon today and sit around and listen to the political chatter. Go to other countries, name them, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal. Listen to the political chatter and you will get an indication of what it could be if somebody were to make a decision to stay. Go to Uganda and listen. Just being around the atmosphere for some time, you will get the atmosphere. Now, if Uganda were to sneeze in the direction of Kenya, do you think that Kenya would catch the cold? From what we've seen, I personally don't think so. But do we see indications that perhaps that could happen?
Personally, as far as the executive is concerned, I wouldn't say there's a big danger into going to that direction. But then I'm looking at it in terms of the new perspective that has come in, as Eric pointed out, that we are looking at term limits in terms of the danger that we are facing in Kenya is at maybe county level, where someone has served 2 terms but again gets into another high level office, which goes against...
It's still a county office.
Yeah, it's still a county office, or an influential office which is against the principles or what term limits support. So that is the danger that I'm looking at but not at executive level.
Maliba, do you see a danger?
I think we are not even scratching the surface on that, because we are saying it and not saying it because of one reason. There is a case in Uasin Gishu. The former governor is the senator. There is you've seen those clips of a project that went Ori, the Canadian. I don't know what was the other country.
Finland.
See, the senator, he's now the senator, supposed to be oversighting the county government.
Yes.
He's sitting in places, what I would call barazas, to try and solve problems where people in that particular county have got issues with the county on a program that happened during his tenure
as governor.
So you already see how that becomes messy. That's too messy already. So exactly where does Manda go? How does he sit into it? It's a mess. It's a big one. But then there is a real danger, even here, for us actually working at the executive level, going back on terms, or now the term limits. Number one, you see, what stopped BBI from happening? And like she said, she says that these things are normally incremental. If it were not for the courts, we would actually have gone to a referendum. And God knows that it was almost impossible for that referendum, if it had gone to the people,
to fail.
Already we were changing structurally. And a lot of times the bills, I said
incremental.
A lot of those things that were out there that were appealing to the people were, in my words, just icing on the cake. There was the BBI in the BBI.
There was the poison.
So it was deep in there, and it was about restructuring government so that then people were already talking. You remember when Yakub Salah, for example, might not be an insider, a UDA insider. He's not within the inside circle. He's not even a policy hawk within that particular space. Is that particular guy, the Fafi MP, is not one of those people you will see on the street. He's not so much Kenya Kwanza. But then even as he says that, just remember that in the just ended administration, people like Murade, who are insiders, were saying that the law does not then stop a president from running as a deputy president. Remember that? They were talking about then doing the Kaputni thing we are talking about. So it's possible. It's not like it's not very far. And in our case, unfortunately, I have got a serious issue with CDF, because today, if there's anything that can sneak in the term limits, is actually CDF.
It's the carrot.
And I'll demonstrate it this way. Number one, standing between the term limit are 2 things. Number one, you need 2/3 in parliament, and then you need a simple majority in a referendum. CDF has actually been used to manage parliament. So if we entrench CDF, it becomes much easier to manage the legislature. You will end up having that majority. If anyone had that idea. So for us, CDF is going to be that weak point. It is that little earthworm that needs to be killed now before it turns into a serpent. Because already it's sitting so badly on. It was our pilot project on devolution. It worked. Before CDF, we had district development boards and committees. They worked in their own way. So now that we've got devolution, CDF must completely be taken away from parliament for parliament to be parliament. If parliament is going to be the guardian of our democracy, it's one of those things that we should not pretend around. It's the easiest way. From where I sit,
it's a big issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel I do concur with what you're saying, and just to add, why for me my observation also comes from how we manipulate the political party system. We don't have a very strong hold with political parties, and one of the ways you may not have the same president coming in, but we may have these political parties that then brings a different person, just replacing one on the other. And then whatever was happening, if it was a regime that is continued through the ruling political party dominance, then that is something we could worry about. And that's why we see the resistance is a bit, you could say it's weak maybe in Uganda because of that political party dominance. You may see another country where presidents are changing, but the dominance of the party remains. And that also affects that's also a danger that we could see, because political parties, well, the constitution foresees them as channels for citizens' political engagement. In reality, they are not. There's an elite control of that. Secondly, maybe, and to take this point further by Maliba, is yes, for me, I get worried every time you'd expect the institutions that should be checking exercise of power becomes weaker and weaker. And part of the reasons why the case in court was to challenge the CDF being held by legislature is because it violates a very principle of the constitution on the exercise of power, separation of power, and the ability of parliament to check on an executive. So we have these proposals that are still there, and for me it's quite worrying. For me, I feel anytime you see a proposal for constitutional amendments, I think the idea is look further. What will this do? And if we have now the CDF being protected through a constitutional amendment, then it means that it circumvents a court decision that was actually trying to reinforce a principle of the constitution. Then we introduce an oversight fund for Senate. Then we introduce something also for county assemblies at the county levels. What does that mean? That one, if we were to ever have an amendment that needs to go through all the, even if it's the amendment that requires the higher process of going through the counties and coming all the way to be ratified at the national level, there's a problem. And I think that should worry us. So for us, I think even as we discuss the issue of term limits, because earlier on we said it is not the only, when we look at the bigger picture, it should worry us when we see that a system of the constitutional arrangement where we have a parliament that is supposed to check on power, and we see that power being diluted, and eventually we reconsolidate. Or we also see a system where we have a devolved governance, but increasingly we keep on seeing funding being re-centralized, or funding being used to dilute the power that should be exercised at the county level. Then we should be worried, because all these different factors then have an impact on how will this power at the national level be exercised. And I think we should also be worried that even 11, 12 years later, we still have a very central presidency that the power has not devolved as we expect. And I think the idea is to go further and continue implementing what the constitution foresees on diluting, decentralizing power. But we have a situation of re-centralization of power. Yeah.
I'm still coming back into, if our definition and the reason why we have term limits is so that we can check and control power and how long one wields that power, then why do we only limit it to those executive roles? Why not also on the legislative roles? Because this person who's in the executive office has been elected by the people, has been chosen by the people, but you're telling the people that you cannot elect this person more than 2 terms. But you are also telling the people you can elect so-and-so to represent you in parliament, to be the one that determines how you are taxed, to be the one that determines all these other things, for as long as you feel like electing them. Why? You end up having people who will be in parliament for years, and they just become the power barons. They're the ones who determine, okay, who gets into parliament. The conversation as it progresses into if Kenya should adopt a parliamentary system, and you'd have members of parliament with no term limits, then basically what we're saying is we shall be having people who sit in parliament and they determine who becomes the head of the executive. They'll be the power barons. Should term limits be introduced to the legislative seats as well? Patricia?
I think we've seen that discussion also arising in other countries, like, for instance, the US. And I would say this is a discussion, again, for Kenyans. We can't sit here and say it should or should not. I think it's a discussion that should really go back to the people. And this would come in many ways, like the examples we've seen in Kenya, because the constitution sometimes does not foresee everything. But then also the way democracy is exercised and organically exercised, there are lessons to be drawn. Then if it becomes a legitimate concern for the people, then let the people also discuss about it and also decide about it.
Let the people decide.
Yeah.
So this report that you produced, it's a good report, and where can one access it if they would like to read it? Can they come to your website?
Yeah, so you can access the report or the publication on our website, that is www.katibainstitute.org. Yeah, under publications we have it. We have physical copies, so if someone is interested to get physical copies, they can get in contact with us. We have our contact details on our website.
Okay.
Then we can organize how they can get physical copies as well.
It's an important publication. It's good to have these conversations going. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
Kevin Mabonga, Head of Communications, and Patriciah Joseph, who's the Program Manager at the Katiba Institute.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.